Today is October the 19th, 2011. My name is Hersh Libo, and together with Marcy Schoenfeld, we're at the home of Jack Lichenthal at 45 Carriage Drive South in Stamford, Connecticut. We're here to interview Jack on behalf of the Oral History program of the Jewish Historical Society of Lower Fairfield County.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry about that, it's Jack Lichenthal, but by any other name, he would still be Jack Lichenthal. Good afternoon, Jack. As you know, we're here on behalf of the Jewish Historical Society of Lower Fairfield County, and would like to get your life story.
Well, that's
So, let's start from the beginning. Where were you born? Tell us a little bit about your family.
well, I was born in Brooklyn, New York, and in the Bensonhurst area, and I originally lived in a multiple family building, and I can still remember that my mother used to give us air, so to speak. There were fire escapes, and she put down a nice little blanket, and there I would be outside getting some air. And then the family moved into what is typically Brooklyn, and that is these four family houses. And it was still in Bensonhurst, it wasn't too far away. And I went to the local schools in Brooklyn, graduated from New Utrecht High School, and at New Utrecht High School I kind of excelled in history, and was in line for first prize, the Regents examination, but what happened was I messed up on one essay and came in second. So that's the story of my life. I come in second in tennis tournaments. So it all began in Brooklyn.
Where did your parents come from?
Oh, well, my parents, my father, interestingly enough, was born on the Lower East Side. His parents came from Horodenka, and that's in East Galicia. At one time was part of Poland, and now, and then after the Second World War, became a part of the Soviet Union. And what happened was that my father's family, meaning his father and mother, and the boys in the family, there were four others, came to the Lower East Side, where my father was born, and my grandfather could not find work, and his wife just didn't like. She couldn't adjust. She couldn't speak the English language, and so what happened is they went back.
What year what year was your father born?
So that was around 1916.
But he went back,
Yeah, right. He went back around 1916.
what year was he born? Remember?
They returned to Horodenka in 1916, and my father was born in 1906. So that when he was basically he was a young lad when they returned.
How did they get back during
Well,
the war?
Well, what happened? This is basically they got back on a ship. You know, they came.
No, but it was 1916, World
Yes.
War II was,
No, World War I.
one rather.
Right.
Was gone.
Okay, well, they got back. I don't know exactly how,
Okay.
to be honest with you. But I'm sure it was by ship because that's the way it was done. And what happened was that when they got back to Horodenka, my grandfather had difficulty making a living there. At one time, the family had owned a bathhouse, and they prospered during this period, but the bathhouse burned. And when the bathhouse burned, my grandfather had to accept some other kind of work. which basically what he was doing was trading horses. He would buy horses, fatten them up, and then they would drive them to another area and sell them. In any case, what happened was my grandfather decided to take his youngest son, which is my father, back to the States, hoping that he could work for his brother, who was a furrier in Brooklyn.
So he came back what year?
Well, he came back right after the First War was over, around 1926. So 1926, they returned, and at this time, my father was living with his uncle, and he was working and learning the fur trade. He found that he had difficulty working with his uncle, so he went off on his own as a cutter, and that became the formation of a partnership that he had with Sam Weiner, and that partnership lasted for over 40 years. And they never had a contract. The way the fur business was done during those days is really by word. Your word was your honor. So orders were taken for lots of money, and people never signed contracts. It just didn't do it. You know,
brothers, sisters?
Yes, I have a brother, and his name is Bernard. I don't have any sisters, so I have a single brother, and he lives in Brooklyn.
So then, where did you go to school then?
Well, I would just like to finish this for a
Oh.
moment, if you don't mind, excuse me. So what happened was that my father and his father would send money back to the family in Europe, hoping for the time when they could bring them back again. But as you well know, that didn't happen, because when the Second World War broke out, Horodenka was completely wiped out. The village that had about maybe 1,000 people, they were taken to the concentration camp. Those who were taken. So I never really got that story even from my father. So my father and his father remained in the States, and the rest of the family, and Horodenka really was, they were completely killed by the Nazis. And we know this because they have published a book about her. The Horodenka Society is a very old society. It exists in New York City. I was a member of it. My father held all of the offices. They have a burial a society where my father is buried in New Jersey. And in any case, so the Horodenka sort of continues to live, and they support causes in Israel at this present day. And in 1963, they published a book about everything that I'm sort of telling you, and it's published in Yiddish and in English and in Hebrew.
What are your earliest memories of your childhood?
I spent most of my childhood at Sedgwick camps in Port Jervis, New York, and I think that was the best experience, frankly, that I had. And I went there every summer, met people, and I enjoyed the sports and enjoyed the Sedgwick camps had a reconstructionist idea. It's a Reconstruction Judaism. So what happened was they observed the Shabbat. It was naturally kosher, and there were speakers that came to the camp that spoke about different aspects of Judaism, etc.
So this was what, during the 40s?
Yes.
And did you encounter any anti-Semitism while you lived in Brooklyn?
Well, I lived in Brooklyn, and Brooklyn had neighborhoods, and what I encountered, what I would say is in anti-Semitism is that I went to a Talmud Torah. So we went 5 days a week. At one point, we studied, when we studied the Bible, we studied the Rashi commentaries on.
Stop. Okay.
So the times that I encountered anti-Semitism was during the Easter time. When we left the Talmud Torah, I mean in the evenings, when it was dark, there would be people that would be shooting at us with BB guns and stuff like that. So we had to sort of fight our way home. So that was one example of it, I would say. And then, of course, a vivid memory that I had was walking the streets during Easter when the priests would rant about the Jews killing Christ. But I knew that this was, you know, I can't actually say, I mean, it didn't affect me personally, you know, but I knew that this was something that was vile, and it was just not true.
Do you remember anything going on during World War II? You were very young, but
Yeah.
attempts by Jews to bring out the fact of what was going on with Hitler in Germany and so forth. Do you remember any?
Well, we supported our relatives that lived in Israel, and of course, I mean, at this time, I was still in junior high school and early high school. So we were, you know, we were aware of what was happening in the war, and of course there would be rumors that it was very. My father would say it's very bad for the Jews in Europe.
So after
Very
high
bad.
school, you went on to.
After high
College?
school, I went on to the University of Connecticut.
How did you happen to go to Connecticut from New York?
Well, I wanted to get away from New York City, frankly, and I was accepted to University of Connecticut. I had to go to a school, frankly, that I could afford, or that I knew my parents could afford. And at that time, tuition at the University of Connecticut was like under $600 a year. So it was the most reasonable university for outside students.
So
And I really kind of knew at that time that I would become a school teacher and teach history because I was good in it. You know, I knew it's something that I could do, you know.
Yeah.
And I was very focused on what I was going to be doing when I went to the University of Connecticut. I was kind of fortunate. When I was at the University of Connecticut, I was in a History Honor Society. I got into debating at the University of Connecticut. So I debated for the University of Connecticut and had the unique distinction of being chosen to introduce Eleanor Roosevelt when she came to UConn, and to actually to be beside her at a dinner. So I sort of was a little ambassador, you might say, and that was because of debating.
You went on with postgraduate education.
Oh, well, postgraduate education was not at UConn. I went to the University of Wisconsin. Now the instructor that I wanted to major in U.S. social and intellectual history. And UConn did not have really a master's program in that at that time. I had taken all of the courses from the head of the department, who was an intellectual historian. He wrote a book about Al Smith, and he was an excellent instructor, and he wrote recommendations for me. So I got into the schools that I applied for, and that is North Carolina and the University of Wisconsin, and also Michigan. So I decided on the University of Wisconsin because of Merle Curdy, who was that time probably one of the most prominent historians in that field. He sort of created the field, although Wisconsin had a great tradition of historians. And so it was a very good time for me. And at that time, I also took courses in curriculum, in education. And I was told by one of my professors that he would like to have me work, study for a PhD under him in education. But I was really sold on history and doing graduate work in history and curriculum for that matter. So when I left Wisconsin, I enrolled at Columbia University, and I was also going to school at the new school, the graduate faculty in New York City. And after a while, I decided to give up the education, the curriculum development, and get a PhD in political philosophy. And there I had some just fantastic, outstanding scholars like Hans Kohn, Hans Jonas, and these people, and Howard White, who was my major advisor. So I developed so my education really took off there.
So in that time, though, you were
Yes.
in the service?
Oh, yes. Well, of course, I was in the service before I started the schooling. So I was in the United States Army, and I was a specialist in training, of all things. So I had a great job in the Army.
How did
In
you?
the Army, I initially started out as a typist, doing administrative duties, but I was transferred to a post which is the top Army post at Fort Belvoir. It's called the engineering post, and there I found while I was working as a clerk, basically doing just administrative duties, I found that there was an opening in the training department. So I went to my sergeant and I said, Sergeant, I said, I'm really qualified for this job. I've got a master's degree in curriculum and development. I could certainly be of use to the training and methods branch. So he says, well, if you can find me your replacement, I'll let you transfer out. I said, Sergeant, you know everybody who's coming in and who's leaving. How am I going to be able to do this? He says, well, that's what you have to do. So I had friends in all of these little battalions who were the morning report clerks. So I said, any new person who comes in to that unit who's not assigned to any place, you let me know immediately. So one day I dragged the body in and I said, Sarge, I found my replacement. So he let me out, and there, I had a fantastic job. At this time, this country was getting involved with Vietnam. And there were Vietnamese officers and other officers who needed some of the engineering techniques that Fort Belvoir had.
What
So it shows-
years did you do your military service?
Oh, well, I did my military service from 1957 to 1958. And so this was the beginning. Actually, some people trace it back to Eisenhower, but
Dien Ben Phu, huh?
right, that's right. And these officers, what happened is they were trained, and they would have their own translator, and you had the Army sergeants training them in how to construct these bridges. So they wanted to build up their language proficiency. Actually, I wasn't doing that at all. I was involved in a speed reading program to help our own Army officers increase their reading speed with the same comprehension. And the Army, at that point, they gave me the opportunity, first of all, to help develop that program by going to New York University and looking at their reading clinics there. But the language program I developed on my own. So I developed sort of like a basic conversational approach, which these officers were very, very pleased with. And eventually I got a commendation for that from the commanding general for this language program that I did basically on my own.
So you finished college, you finished your master's, you were in the service,
Yeah.
then you went on with your PhD.
I
And
went
how
on,
did-
yeah. Well, it took me 10 years to
Yeah.
get that.
So you finished,
In between that, I met Lois
well, that's what I'm getting to. But first, how did you come to
Stanford.
Stanford?
Well, I went to the University of Connecticut. I did my student teaching up outside of Hartford. And so I thought that, I was looking for a place, so to speak, that was close enough to New York City. And so I interviewed in Greenwich, in Darien, New Canaan, and Stanford. And Stanford, I had a very good interview with, that time, Louise Mosher, and she hired me right on the spot, so to speak.
So it was during that time when you started here that you met your wife, or your
Yes,
future wife.
yes,
What's her name?
Lois.
And where did she come from?
Well, Lois at that time was working as a dental hygienist. And it's a kind of funny story on how I met her. The young teachers at that time, Stanford High School was on double sessions. And in fact, when I started teaching, I also decided that there ought to be a program for bright young people who want to do something other than sports. So I created a debating club. And one of the debaters who was on that debating club is the present Senator of Connecticut, Senator Joe Lieberman. So Joe Lieberman was one of my debaters. He was also president of the senior class during that time. So it gave, and we would go outside the community. I would arrange debates, did this all on my own, without pay, I might say. In fact, I was a debating coach for close to 12 years and basically didn't get paid for it. And what happened with the young teachers at this time would get together on weekends and we'd have parties. Because it was very close. Stanford had just one high school, it was double sessions, so people sort of knew one another. And I lived across the street from the high school in a building that was owned by Mr. Goldberg, who was, somebody mentioned Pacific Street, he had the market, the market, the chicken market there. And Debbie Berman is a daughter of who's in Stanford today, of Mr. Goldberg. Well, what happened is we had 3 people living in this apartment, and we didn't have a shower. So one day I went down to Mr. Goldberg. I said, we have this little bathtub, and one of the people was 6'3". I says, he can barely get clean. I said, if we don't get a shower, he's going to be condemned. We're going to have a health problem. So Mr. Goldberg says, okay, I'll get you a shower. So we got, at this time, Dave Fischel of the construction company, the Fisher Construction Company. So he was the plumber. So he came up, and in the bathtub, he put a single pipe with a little shower head. So I said, so we have to have a shower party in honor of this new shower. So we invited everyone to our new shower party. And I invited someone, and Lois was dancing with someone else, and I asked her to dance. And I said to her, I said, you're really a very nice person, and I'm gonna call you. And Lois didn't think I would ever call her back. But sure enough, it showed up that I did. And since then, that's
When did you get married?
So we got married in 1960. Well, listen, gotta have Lois.
Married in 1960.
Yes.
And subsequently, you had how many children?
Well, we have 2 children. The first was our real pleasure because Lois had no difficulties. It was Ilana. Alana Tamar, and her last name is Kyle, and she lives in Incline Village in Nevada, and she's got 2 boys. They're twins.
Yeah.
They're 4-year-olds, right? And the son who came afterwards, who did sleep nights.
His name? What's his name?
Is Stuart Michael. And Stuart Michael is living in Shanghai, and he's got 2 boys, and one is going to be bar mitzvahed very shortly. And in June, and we were in China the past summer, not this summer, but the summer before that. So we saw the family there, and
What does he do?
he's an engineer, and he works in a fabricating factory that duplicates microchips that are used in earphones and for different medium-sized companies that use microchips in their business. And he's got about a half a dozen engineers working for him. They're all Chinese. He's naturally fluent in Chinese. He's been fluent in Chinese since he went to school. He went to the University of Chicago. He graduated with a degree in mathematics and went to the university. He's also, after that, he got an electrical engineering degree from University of Colorado in Boulder. And he then went on to the University of Illinois, working on a PhD, and really, he got to the point where he could have completed it, but he decided that he wanted to do something practical with his hands. And so he wound up in Taiwan, met his wife, who's Taiwanese. Her name is Heaven. They're married. And since then, he's been in Asia.
You visited there, what was it, this past summer or the summer before?
Yeah, summer before.
Yeah, it was interesting. There was a Jewish museum.
Yes. Yeah, there is.
Tell us about that.
Well, what was kind of interesting is we knew,
By the
in
way, that's
history-
in Shanghai.
yes,
We didn't
yes,
mention
you're absolutely right. Yeah, Shanghai was an open city during the Second World War, and anywhere from 20 to 30,000 Jews came from Austria and mostly through Vienna, and got an exit visa to go to Shanghai. And initially, when they went to Shanghai, the city was open, so there wasn't what people refer to as a Shanghai ghetto. Didn't happen. What happened was when the Germans and the Japanese, in 1937, the Japanese had conquered all of China. So Shanghai naturally was part of the Japanese sphere. But in 1939, they signed a pact with the Germans. So the Germans at that point had an officer in Shanghai and insisted and made many demands on the Japanese. First of all, he insisted that they stay in one section, which the Japanese eventually acceded to the request. And actually, what the Germans wanted, or the Nazis wanted, was to take these people eventually and send them to concentration camp under the Hitler program. But the Japanese weren't willing to go along with that. Japanese had an idea that they wanted the Jews to settle in China because they would be very good in building the Japanese empire because of their financial skills. And eventually what happened was that the Jews had to settle in this area, and eventually they had to put a stop on the emigration into Shanghai. Now presently there is a museum where one of the sections that the Jews were forced to live in exists, but it's very small, and there are several buildings, and it's it tries to tell the story, you know, but it really is underfunded, and it's really not really up to what it should be, you know. But there are a lot of, there have been films about the Shanghai.
Are there many Jews still living in Shanghai?
Today, there are about, yes, that's a good question. It's interesting. On a trip that we were on in Shanghai, we went to a tour, and I see a person with a beard and a kippah. And I walk over to him and I ask him who he is, and he tells me that he's a rabbi and of Chabad, which is in Shanghai. And he invites me to Friday night Shabbat dinner. He says, and the food is good. I says, I'm sure it is. But I said, unfortunately, I'm on this tour, and I have to pretty much stick with what's happening, you know, with the trip. And what happens is my son goes to that Chabad on Friday nights, even today. But to answer your question directly, there are about 2,500 Jews today in Shanghai, mostly on business, from all over the world. And but Shanghai once was a major Zionist, had a Zionist press, right around the turn of the 20th century.
So, can you get bar mitzvah in Shanghai?
Yes, in fact, if you want an invitation, I'll speak to my son, because his son is getting bar mitzvah.
That's what we want.
Yes, it's coming.
Very nice.
You're welcome.
Now, you've lived here in Stanford for what, about 50 years?
Yeah, close to 50
So
years.
where did you live originally? You told me on Strawberry Hill. After that,
Well, we started, Lois and I had our first apartment on Bedford Street, right across from the Presbyterian Church. And at that time, it didn't have the bell tower. And from there, we left and went to Southport and bought a small little Cape Cod house. Actually, we couldn't afford to live in Stanford. My salary in 1958 with a master's degree was $3,200. So I always had another job, basically had to have another job. And so we had to find a place that we could afford. And boy, was that difficult. And one day we saw a house advertised in Southport for $14,000. And we said, wow, we've hit it. This is the place that we can afford. So Lois put down $50. She had a paycheck. And the attorney that closed this house is really a very famous person. It's his friend who owned that little Cape Cod house with asbestos shingles, with no garage, and of which we, in any case, what happened, and the entire house, the entire first floor was painted this dark green. If you walked into it, you thought you were in a forest. You couldn't see anything. It was so dark. But anyway, I painted it over a period of time and was commuting, by the way. This time I was commuting to school, which means teaching at Stanford High School, but also I was on a scholarship at the graduate faculty in New York City, where I got my PhD. In any case, that famous attorney's name is George Balter, who handled a major case before the Supreme Court. And I told him, George, I says, we can't afford 14,000. We can only do 12,000. He says, okay, we'll do it. So he sort of, he actually closed the deal for us. He was our attorney and the seller's attorney, and what a wonderful man. And at some point later in my life, I got a hold of a copy of a Daumier, and I brought it to his office, as a thank you gift.
so then from there you finally moved back into
Stanford.
Stanford.
Yeah, but this is not the first house that we had. We lived across the street from Ripon High School. We then lived on West Hill, which is not too far from here, and then we came to this house.
In what year?
Well, yeah.
Approximately.
Well, 45, just subtract 45 years from where we are right now, 46. We don't think about years.
And then you became
Yes.
involved here with the Jewish affairs, and various synagogues. You just briefly tell us about that.
Well, as I said, one of the jobs that I always had a second and third job, really. I was either teaching part-time at a college, which was UConn or Fairfield University, or the University of Bridgeport.
Teaching what?
at Fairfield University, I taught in the school, in the Graduate School of Education. So I taught a course in curriculum development. And at UConn, it was a course in U.S. history, and at the University of Bridgeport, it was in U.S. history. So but in addition to that, I've been a principal of Temple Sinai Religious School, and prior to that, I was a teacher there. And I also was, worked for Bethel in Stamford. And in Norwalk, I was a principal of Congregation Bethel in Norwalk for a couple of years. So I always had sort of like an afternoon job while I was going to school. In this it took me 10 years to get the PhD, by the way, so I feel that's a major accomplishment. So,
You also did a lot of work with the Transit Authority.
oh yeah, well, I wound up. What happened was that after 22 years as a high school teacher, and in Stamford, I sort of retired, but I was only 52 years old. So 52 years old, without a great deal of income behind it, it's pretty difficult to so I had to look for work, so to speak. But I didn't retire looking for work. I retired to go into a business. And the business was a marketing business that that catered to the new industry that was just starting. And no one had customer service training programs, and that was the cable industry. And that was in 1970. So cable, it's amazing, is a very young industry. Today we accept it, you just, there's so much programming. But when we started, I had met someone who was connected in the cable industry, who was a marketing director. And he wanted to know how to develop training programs. So I've always been able to take my curriculum ideas, so to speak, or in the educational field, and transfer it into the business world. So this company that we started was a marketing company to major corporations in the cable industry that had offices in these towns all over that needed a professional type training program to teach people how to sell the different tiers of service, so that when somebody called in and wanted to upgrade their service, the person at the other end could explain what the price was and what different services were. And so this company really clicked, except that the partner wanted the whole company. So I had to sell it to him. And there again, I was still young, I was in my 50s. And so I had to find employment with another company. I worked for example, remodeling consultants in Mamaroneck, and I developed a training program for teaching architects sales techniques and estimating. And the boss was very progressive. He gave me the authority of developing a whole school structurally too. So I designed a training room, and then we actually went out in recruiting architects who wanted to, you know, sell additions to people. And basically, they did very high-class kitchens, bathrooms, and second-story additions. And after that, eventually, I worked my way out of that job. The boss one time, he says, you know, Dr. Jack, we're so successful right now, we can't take any more business. We don't have to hire any more people, so we're gonna have to close the school. I says, well, that's okay. And then I was
When was that?
very fortunate. I was very fortunate to go out and find and that was in 1987. So in 1987, I interviewed, and I was very fortunate that the MTA, that's the Metropolitan Transportation Authority in New York City that runs the buses and the trains, they were looking for trainers. They had just started a training department. So I found one of the, somebody through an interview. I interviewed for Bosse's job in Long Island. And the guy wanted to hire me, but he says, well, this job is filled. But he says, I know someone in New York City, and he's looking, this person, I think they're looking for trainers. Why don't you tell him you know me, So I called that person that very day, and he says, yeah, come on down. And I had training manuals that I had developed in the cable industry that this guy looked at. He says, well, could you give these to me? I says, oh no. I said, these are proprietary. I says, but I can certainly adapt something that would be suitable. And so I was hired on probation. Well, I was kind of lucky during this probationary period. There was a major accident in New York City where there was a train operator who tested twice the level of intoxication, who went around a turn and took out some pillars that was holding up 14th Street. That whole 14th Street almost collapsed, So now what happened is they had to get passengers out of these cars, and they only had oxyacetylene in welding. They didn't have the new MIG types of welding, which you can bring on through a battery, and so they had to bring in outside people with MIG experience. So now the Transit Authority realized that in any future situation, they had to retrain all of their welders in MIG. And sure enough, I was there to create this training program. So I met with a welder, Louis Valdez, bless his heart. I says, Louis, I said, I'm not a welder, but I can put together a structured training program where we can get the welders in and we can bring them up to, and a program was successful. And so that sealed my, and really, through the Transit Authority, I sort of worked my way up to the point where I became a manager, even though I didn't manage any people.
When did you leave the Transit Authority?
In 2000.
And have you worked at a regular job since then?
A regular job?
Or you retired, or?
I'm an investor. So that's, since 2000, I'm investing my resources.
So you would say,
enjoying
at
it.
this point, in 1960, you retired, I'm sorry,
Right,
in
2000,
2000,
yes,
you more or less retired from
Right.
your teaching
right.
duties.
Well,
So
this,
tell me about your community
Training.
involvement. Sorry.
community involvement? Well, I was for a short period of time on the Stanford Board of Representatives. So ran for office, and we were members of Agudas Shalom and Temple Sinai and Congregation Bethel. And basically, we're also members of the JCC, and we attend a number of functions that they have.
How about at the present time? Are you active in any organization?
Not specifically, no.
How about your activity in, you mentioned your activity in Jewish temples and so forth.
Yes.
Are there any other Jewish activities that you were involved with?
Basically, I was involved. Yale University had an excellent program on anti-Semitism. Study of it was called the Yale Institute for actually the study of anti-Semitism, and it was run by Dr. Charles Small, and I wanted to have the Yale become a center where they would sponsor different types of forensic forums and assemblies where Jewish youth, through synagogues and other means, would come and participate. Almost like some of the things that Theodor Herzl years and years back was thinking about. But I couldn't get Charles Small. Charles Small and the Yale Institute. So in any case, what I'm saying is we would go to the seminars in New Haven and participate. I actually participated in, because I've got some expertise in 17th century Jewish, the Jewish experience in this country and in England. And so I've sat on a panel in discussions of this. And I sort of, I take an active interest. I'm sort of putting together things, hopefully one of these days maybe publish it, because I wrote a dissertation on Puritan eschatology. And so it had to do with the 17th century.
Would you explain what eschatology is?
Well, eschatology is the study of those events that indicate that the end of the world is imminent. And it's very much part of the Christian tradition, and it has been very much instrumental in, for example, the movement of the Puritans coming to this country. And there is, in this country right now, unfortunately, the mistaken view that this country was founded only on Christianity. But there's a very, very strong Judaic influence, basically, and that story needs to be presented again, and that's what I would like to do, frankly. Because you see, the Puritans had a very strong pro-interest, as well in England with Cromwell, as well as the Puritans in America, on the role of the Jewish people in the imminent signs that indicated that the end of the world was approaching. Now, they got this from their study of the prophets, and they got this from their study of the book of Revelations. And this is a very creative, interpretive way of assigning certain dates and historical events to the final events, which includes the defeat of Satan and his agents, and taking them and putting them in the abyss and chaining them so that they can never be. And it's very much part of the Jewish tradition, because as you well know, Satan is present and in deceiving Adam and Eve to eat of the forbidden fruit. So the Jewish people, I mean, this is just one aspect. There are other aspects that are much more formidable, which, you know, which I know the Puritans did. For example, they were very much interested in the political system that existed during the King David and his confederation. So the idea of the confederation, which once, you know, the Articles of Confederation, which is part of American history, goes back, of course, to the biblical period too. So what I'm trying to say is, it's not fair. And the laws of Moses, which the Puritans valued very much, were part of the Mosaic Code that were put in the Puritan colonies. So these ideas today are absent in the discussion of the different people who talk about, even from whatever, from the right or the center, who talk about Christian America, which is, again, it's inaccurate.
So going back to your
Yes.
teaching days and
Yes,
your interest in religion and so forth,
yes,
but particularly your teaching days here in Stanford,
yes.
did you encounter anti-Semitism and the hierarchy of
Yeah,
the teaching of the schools here?
yeah. I personally feel, I know, I applied for jobs in Stanford for department chairman. And I know that I was told, and I was told that these jobs were already taken, and they were decided, in other words, before I ever applied. And when I I had all this experience and education, plus PhD. And what happened is that when you had to put your application in, they reduced it to 2 lines. So specifically, they dumbed down the applications so that someone who had a background, somebody that had experience, somebody that had education, simply didn't make it. And that was the Stanford Board of Education. And there's no question about it that this existed.
You wouldn't know if it still exists, or?
I'm sorry to say I don't follow it. And I'm sure it's there.
Well, just to go back to your travel,
But the last superintendent was Jewish. I'm just,
Star.
no, it's,
Yeah.
yeah, he was Jewish.
Yeah.
but going back to just finishing up some of the things that you've experienced besides going to China, what are some of the other leisure activities and travel that you experienced?
Well, we've been to Israel. I took my whole family. We've been there 3 times. And now, the first time that I went to Israel, it's an interesting story. We were there for 6 weeks. We went on a federation sponsored trip. At that time, I was the principal of Temple Sinai. And so there was a trip to visit the different social agents. It was directed supposedly by, the idea was to help social workers in this country and other directors broaden their understanding of what was happening with the social agencies in Israel. So that was our first trip, and that was probably one of the best times. We were there in 1970. Six-Day War was over 3 years ago. They were just clearing out the plaza where the Western Wall is, you know, the Wall of Solomon, and it was a fantastic time to be in Israel. And we were there for 6 weeks, so we visited many places. Now, the most recent trip was, we took my my family, the Shanghai family, Emil's bar mitzvah. That made his bar mitzvah present. We took the whole family and took them to basically Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, right? We split the time, and we went to a wedding. See, I have family in right next to, in Rehovot. Rehovot is one of the oldest settlements in Israel. And I've got relatives that live there, and what happened was we went to a marriage of Lois's sister's daughter married an Israeli. So we went to a wedding in that area of Rehovot. And, you know, we met the family there naturally.
Jack, you've had a long and very busy life. Is there anything you'd like to add to this interview?
I really am very sort of pleased that you people have chosen me. I really appreciate this. I've been instrumental in Stanford's education by developing, when I was a school teacher at West Hill, I developed classes that I thought would be of interest to the students that were just not traditional. Well, one of the classes was a class in different types of political systems in the world, you know, like communist system, like, for example, a parliamentary system in Great Britain and the American system. And one of my graduates told me that he was given a career path, and his name is Dan Malloy. He's the governor of Connecticut. So you never know where you're, what you're going to, who you're going to reach. Another good.
Sorry. You were at Stanford High School. When did you go to West Hill?
Okay. Well, I went from Stanford High School, then I went to Rippewam. Okay, so at Rippewam, I developed a senior seminar and debating. At Rippewam, I had probably two of the brightest young people that have come out of this Stanford school system. This is the public school system. One was a young man by the name of Bill Moslow. He's now the vice dean of biomedical, so he's a medical doctor, biomedical, in North Carolina. North Carolina University. Yes. And the other one, his colleague was Robert Fox, right? And Robert is a well-known psychiatrist, and those guys came up to see me at a reunion, and they said, you know, Dr. Jack, the debating, I taught them an unusual style of debating. It's the technique. In any case, and he says, you know, what you put us through was more challenging than any course we ever had at school. So,
And when did you get to West Hill?
well, West Hill, when West Hill opened, right? At West Hill, I developed an independent study program on my own again. In other words, I did this with, what I'm saying is I met with several teachers after school. So it was, I sort of had to work around administrators. And I said, if we develop this program where these seniors can go outside the school and work with a professional, where one young lady wanted to know about cancer, so she worked in a hospital at Stanford Hospital. Another young man wanted to do ceramics, and so he worked with a potter, a very well-known one, and he's well-known in this community today. He's a well-known potter. So these were types, so this program, as long as I sort of was there, it continued, and then they shut it down. And the department heads took it over and made it into a term paper, so to speak. So I've always had like a little bit of the Stanford school system as in my experience, they sort of have not been as creative as they can be,
Jack, I think you have some plaques and awards in
Yes.
another room.
Well,
Perhaps we could go in there
well,
and
here,
take,
here's a nice, I don't know whether you can see it,
Well,
but I developed, in one of my anthropology classes, I developed a
oops, keep it up.
bubble. This is a bubble. In other words, plastic bubble where people could create things in. And the person that you can see is my son, who came over from an elementary school. So we put these people into this bubble.
And
play
where was
music.
this bubble?
This bubble was in my classroom.
Oh, okay.
We moved all the furniture out and had a huge plastic, we had a motor
what school?
that blew up. This is at West Hill.
I got it.
Great. So we had, and it made the newspapers. And what we tested people, we tested their blood pressures in and outside, played music, had an environment, asked them to write some things down in poetry. And basically what we were trying to do is to show the influence that environment has on people's creativity, And I mean, that plaque.
Have it recorded.
Okay,
Right,
now,
Thank you. Well, in 1970, as I said, we went to Israel, and here is Lois, this lovely olive tree, and right in the background is the Knesset.
angle it. Okay, that's fine. We're losing it.
Tip
Okay.
it down, Jen.
Tip it down. That's fine. Okay. All right. And what else do you have?
Okay, there's another thing that I'm proud of, and that is, I'm gonna wind up with a story that is a favorite story of mine. When I worked for the MTA in New York City, what happened was they had a man who was a training instructor who retired. And they needed a training program to teach ironworkers how to create scaffolds, how to uh, uh, construct these in situations in the transit environment. So I met with iron workers, and after a period of time, we created this training program. And I was invited by the iron workers to participate in their celebration. The iron workers had a celebration of, and I was invited to create a class where children might be interested in becoming iron workers. So I'm very proud of the program. So they gave me a plaque for the work that I did with them. And I'd like to end up with a story, if you don't
And
mind.
it still tells the right time.
And it still tells the right time. Right. So we're doing something right. Well, I'd like to wind up with a story and say this. I created a class called World Great Religions. As you know from this interview, I'm interested in religion, I'm interested in history, I'm interested in politics. And I'm interested in how these forces create, yeah, basically how they create their new forms, how they transfer things from one period of time to another. How, you know, as I say today, we have this mistaken notion that the United States is strictly a Christian, you know, created by Christian nation. And so that's something that, you know, I'm influenced by. Anyway, I created this class called World Great Religions. It had to do with the 5 largest religions in the world. And I had guest speakers come up, ministers, a rabbi, whatever. I had black Muslims come to the class, to a class. Actually, we had to hold it in an assembly because other people wanted to listen to them too. I had somebody who came up with a cobra. He called it Kundalini power. He explained it. So I've had some interesting experiences. The kids loved to come. It was a voluntary class. They didn't have to take this class. These were actually for seniors. These were seniors in high school. Most of these people at this point had jobs. They could have just not taken it. And yet I had 3 classes of over 30 kids.
Wow.
Can you imagine? I mean, really. So, and I used the Bible. In fact, I used this Bible right here, which is the Revised Standard Version. It's the Jewish scriptures and Christian scriptures for the sections on Judaism and Christianity. And I never had one complaint. I never had anyone suggest that I was teaching about religion, because I was teaching about religion, about these different religions. Even before today at West Point, they're finally getting the officers to learn something about Islam, culture of Islam. So we were the only school in the country, I think, United States, that was doing something like this. And of course, when I left the system, these classes are no longer being offered. So, and no one asked me, you know, do you think you can help us with the curriculum to develop? Can we develop some teachers? That's what I'm trying to say. There is no, there's nothing germinating going on in curriculum development from what I know, from the period that I was in, you know. And all I hear is that teaching today is even more difficult. So, won't get into that.
Well, Jack, we want to thank you for your time.
Can
And
I
also
get the story?
congratulate you.
Can I get this last story in?
All right.
Yeah, pardon me. Okay, so what would happen in this
Class.
world, great world religions classes, I used to hand out a book to all the students called As a Man Thinketh. It's written by James Allen. And the story, what the idea of this book is the power of positive thinking, which has influenced more people than probably any other book other than the Bible. It influenced Dale Carnegie, for example, amongst others, you know. So I said, look, if you come to my class and finish, you know, most of them would cut out the last week of school, seniors. I said, this is the book we're going to use. I said, I'm going to give you this book if you show up. Anyway, so I gave this book out, discussed it for a couple of days. Anyway, 3 years later, a young lady comes to see me after class. She says, do you remember Rod? I says, yes. He sat in the third row, first seat. Well, what happened to him? She said, she says, he wasn't much of a student. I says, no, not really. I says, he loved the class. We used to talk back and forth, but he really didn't do much when it came to homework, you know, or tests. He didn't take. She says, well, that's what he did in all his other classes. So I wasn't unusual in that respect. He says, well, he joined the Marines after he got out of your class. And when he was in the Marines, he had this little book that you gave him, and he used to read it and go over it. And I said, well, that's fantastic, unbelievable. I said, well, what happened afterwards? He says, well, afterwards, he didn't know what to do with his life. He was discharged. He saw somebody was advertising selling vacuum cleaners. So he took a job selling vacuum cleaners. Then he bought out that person, and he bought 2 other places. He says now he has 30 people working for him. I said, well, that's fantastic. That's, you know, really thrilled. She says, and the only way he trained these people is using the book that you gave him. I said, well, what can I do for you? She says, well, he lost the book. Do you have another one? And the very next day I brought him another book. So excuse me for stopping you, but I thought that story is too precious not to have.
Well, as I said, we want to thank you very much for allowing us into your home. And I think you should be congratulated for the great influence you had on so many children in the educational system of Stanford.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jack.
Thank you.